On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Jake Moshenko. He is a co-founder and CEO of AuthZed. We're going to be talking about his journey from being an engineer and being a founder now. We're going to talk about that process and kind of his voyage. We're going to talk about ideas and how he's actually followed through on them, because obviously sometimes we have ideas and sometimes we don't follow through, and sometimes we got to pick the right ones to follow through on. We're going to be also talking about his journey as a founder and dealing with both VC and bootstrap companies, some of the nuances and differences. See if we can fit a few more things in there for you before we run out of time. But Jake, thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to get this opportunity.
Absolutely. All right, before we start, why don't you tell everyone what AuthZed does?
Yeah, so at AuthZed, we build permission systems. So we help developers augment their applications with rich or fine-grained permissions, which can really give them a leg up in terms of flexibility and scalability when it comes to specifically the authorizations and permission portions of their applications.
Awesome. I mean, obviously that's a whole episode itself, and maybe that'll be down the road. We'll cover that with you. Let's actually dive in and talk about this topic when it comes to having been an engineer and moved into the founder role. Hopefully people can look you up to kind of get a better sense of your background. Obviously, you've gone and you've had several startups, several projects, several ideas. And whenever I see someone that's kind of gone through this process more than once, I do like to ask them where these ideas originate from. Because sometimes, it's one thing to go, I see a business opportunity, I'm going to go exploit it. But when you find somebody who serially finds these ideas and they can build and scale, I think there's something more there. But I guess the question maybe to you to start off is, as an engineer turned founder, you obviously see tons of problems, tons of different areas that you could spend time. How did you identify the initial problem to solve? And we'll start with this case of AuthZed, since it's their most recent company. How did this idea come about?
Yeah, this particular idea came about because we've actually lived this problem in the past. So the last company that we built and we'll get into that in a minute, I assume. But the last company that we built a product called Quay. Quay was the first private Docker registry. It was even before Docker Hub was a thing. We had this need. We were building a different product at the time, and we had this need for a place to stash container images with our private code in them. And there was nothing on the market. And it was one of those aha moments where we're like, this is an up and coming thing, right? This containerization, this Docker movement, this is an up and coming thing. I bet if we need this, other people need it. And moreover, more people will need it in the future than need it now, right? Because you want to be on sort of the rising edge of a sort of like adoption wave. So in that case, it was, we need this thing. And so we're going to go build it. And while we were building it, one of the challenges we kept running into was authorization. So when you think about what makes our Docker registry private, it's really just authorization, right? You take this concept of a registry and you layer on permissions, who's allowed to download what, who's allowed to access what. And so that was kind of like the big value add for Quay as a product, was the privacy aspect, wrapping this concept of a Docker registry in permissions. And so then it became a function of like, well, that was really painful for us when we were building our last company. I bet that's really painful for a lot of people. So it was basically just the same pattern of take this very painful thing, make sure that it's something that is painful enough and widely felt enough, and also, very importantly, something that people would be capable of paying for, right? So there are a lot of painful things that exist in our lives as engineers, or even in our lives as human beings, that just aren't worth it enough for us to pay money to fix. And so that's kind of like the third criteria, right? It has to be painful, widely felt, and something valuable enough to pay for fixing. So we ran into this authorization problem, and we just said, all right, let's go fix that for everybody.
It's actually really interesting. You mentioned some of the criteria: painful, widely felt, and people actually spend money on it. I think a lot of times people have ideas that they think solve particular problems, and a lot of times it is maybe tribal or something particular to them, and they go about starting something and they realize midway, okay, well, not enough people are willing to pay for it, or it's not a wide enough problem. I guess in your case, when you evaluate these three criteria to kind of decide to take on an idea. Have there been other ideas that you have said, hey, and you don't have to tell us, but when you see other ideas that potentially are like, hey, they fit some of this criteria, but not all, do you keep track of them? Do they just go into the bin and you forget about them? What do you do with those other ideas that don't make it to the table?
Yeah, I mean, there have been a few other ideas that I think are worth pursuing. And then it becomes a prioritization, right? Like, which one of these things is most likely to be durable? Which one of these things is, people would pay the most money for, is the most deeply felt pain, most widely felt? That all basically can be boiled down to like, what's the market opportunity? So there are others. And then I guess you just prioritize by like, which idea do I think I could actually work on for 5 to 10 years, right? Because that's how long it takes a company to really get to escape velocity if you're doing things right. So yeah, there's a really complicated evaluation criteria. There have been some, and this is a muscle, right? It's a muscle that you develop like any other. And now I can like hear about an idea and I can be like, oh, cool idea. I see why they thought of it. And it's not going to work because X, or it's not going to work because Y. And like, that's it's a muscle. It's not always a good feeling, right? Because like these are your friends and they're like, I've got this idea. And you're like, that is a cool idea. I hate to poop on it, but have you thought about this? Right? Like, and that's usually sort of like the diplomatic way of trying to guide them into seeing it through that lens of market opportunity. And can you go and actually solve this problem for money? But yeah, I've had probably 500 ideas that go into the trash heap, for every one that actually seems viable.
That's too good. I like it. I mean, that is actually interesting. And you mentioned it's a muscle. Maybe we weren't. Yeah, this is a question that potentially we weren't really going to talk about, but I am curious. When you mention it's a muscle, obviously, if you exercise it more often, as the role of a CEO, you can now, having gone through this a couple of times, you've seen it. You have some things to look for. If you could put yourself back, first time founder, back when you first started your first product, that muscle is very hard to develop for some. Are there things that you can do to potentially improve that? And I think this is actually applicable to a lot of people, for just even outside of what we're talking about, because I think a lot of times people don't do something because it's not natural. And then once it is natural, they're like, oh, I can do this all day. But how do you work on that muscle memory, especially when it comes to this particular area?
I think you need to fail a lot. Unfortunately, I don't think there's like a super quick way. One thing that happens is that you can over-index on success stories, and it's harder to get access to like failure stories and like what really happened in failure stories. It's like, well, people know this thing didn't turn out super great, but you don't always know why unless you were involved in actually doing it. So I've also wasted a huge amount of time building things that didn't have any viability, like in retrospect. Even our first company, or like the first company that we built, that Quay came out of, we didn't start out building Quay. We started out building a web integrated development environment, like a web code editor. And the idea itself is fine, and it seemed timely. Like Chromebooks were gaining traction, like more stuff was happening on the web. The web was higher fidelity. This was back in 2012. But the thing that we didn't think about was how we were actually going to build and monetize this thing at scale, and what a development environment entails, like all put together, right? So like at the time, we had this sort of fuzzy idea that if we could build this thing and nail it, people would show up and pay for it. It was a huge problem, right? We ended up with what I call this like N by M integration problem, where you have all of these different languages and all of these different libraries and all of these different runtimes, and people wouldn't adopt the tool unless you could tick off like all 11 boxes that they needed for their particular development environment. And we were a bootstrapped company. We weren't going to do that as like a 2 or 3 person company. So that was an idea that we should have gone and tried to secure funding for and build out a team and develop all those integrations, or find a different plugin ecosystem that we could leverage. So that was a failure too, right? We tried that idea. We never made it to where we wanted to, but we were sort of lucky, I guess, in the same way that like Slack was lucky in realizing that communication was the thing that they were capable of solving, not building a game. For us, it was, we've got this very critical need. No one's filling it right now. No one's even trying to fill it. Like, let's just go hurry up and do it, get a prototype out there and see if people adopt it. So it's just the building the muscle is just trying things, trying a lot of things, not being afraid to fail, right? Like if you go into it thinking, I'm going to fail more than I'm going to succeed, it doesn't sting so badly when you do end up failing. So yeah, I guess just practice.
I mean, I think that's actually very well put. And I think it's actually quite easy to understand. I think it's really hard for some to do that failure point. I know everyone says, fail fast and learn. I think people always wonder when you're a founder and you have all these decisions to make, and people talk about one-way, two-way doors, and I think those are great. At the time, you always don't know what a one-way or two-way door is. I think it's easy to look back and go, oh, that was a one-way door, two-way door. Or if you're in a big business where you're focused on a very particular sector, yeah, you can talk about one-way, two-way doors because your effect is small. As a founder, and just your experiences through these multiple companies that you've run, when you look at decisions, you look at the magnitude, you realize there's a lot resting on your shoulder for success and failure. You can get paralyzed, but yet the decisions have to be made. Where do you typically fall, or what type of decisions in terms of confidence do you focus on? And I guess I'm trying to ask, like, do you need to be 90% confident or 80%? 51%, and obviously it depends on the decision, right? So different decisions, but I think this is an interesting question because a lot of people, when they hear fear of failure, they have to get to 90 some percent before they pull a decision because they're like, that's where I feel comfortable and secure, and obviously risk tolerance. So this is a very loaded question. I know that, but I am curious because as a founder, you have to make these decisions. You can't wait for 99.9% surety.
Yeah, you absolutely can't. And as an engineer turned founder, right, I'm probably maybe even more susceptible than most to analysis paralysis. Right, there's always more information to get. There's always more things to test. There's always ways to kick the decision down the road. I think an interesting thing is to try to let other people make decisions when possible. There's something sort of final about making a decision as a founder or as a CEO that people are afraid to push back on that. Whereas if they make the decision themselves, sometimes they'll be more open to revisit it. And I mean, that's going to be person to person, archetype to archetype dependent. But like, if I say like, go do this thing this way, it's like, well, I better do this thing this way or else, right? That's the implication, even though that's not the reality, right? I'm happy for people to try things and fail. And I recognize that I can be wrong, but there is somewhat of a finality to it if I'm the one saying it. So delegating when possible. If a decision does need to be made and it needs to be made by me, then it's just what information can we get a hold of? How can we make the best choice that we can? Back to your one-way, two-way door thing. How final is this decision? Right, there have been probably a handful of times in the company where it's like our crossing the Rubicon moment, or like once we do this, we can't undo it. Right? Once we say this publicly, we can't unsay it. Once we make this action, it's going to tip our hand that we're trying to do this thing. So there have been only a handful of those, and those are the ones that are really agonizing to make. But the other ones, it's like, just make the decision, realize that you're going to be wrong some significant portion of the time, and hopefully it'll be the kind of decision that you can revisit and fix if you are wrong.
I like that. I think hopefully that's good advice for people. I need to actually get better at that. Sometimes I am guilty of analysis paralysis, and part of it stems from I just love to learn more. So I feel like there's no finality of how much I need to learn, but it's good advice you provided. I'm going to take that as well. I did want to switch gears because I did want to cover this because I think a lot of people obviously tuning in talking about to an engineer who's become a founder. You've gone through a few different startups. You mentioned, obviously, venture capital and bootstrap options. And I know both have their nuances, both have some pros and cons. From somebody who's kind of gone through this in a couple of different iterations, it'd be great to kind of hear just some of your learnings, right? When you have taken on venture capital, when you've done decided to go bootstrap the startup, and kind of what somebody can expect from both. I think sometimes people hear the VC side of the story and the bootstrap doesn't get the attention. So I'm kind of curious, maybe and we can start high level. I'd love to kind of hear some of your experiences in both those different ways of founding a company.
I'll start with bootstrap because that's what we did first. And we did that sort of right on the heels of GitHub's success, being like probably the largest bootstrap company at the time. They ended up taking funding and then selling to Microsoft eventually. But we're like, let's just do that. Let's do what they did. I mean, unless you have sort of like an overnight success scenario, or you've got a network that you can lean onto to get your first 100 customers or something, that's like a really sort of perilous journey. And you need to be ready to not have success for kind of a long time, right? And when I say success in a bootstrap company, I mean, you can afford to pay yourselves and have enough money left over to start bringing additional people on to help flesh out different parts of the business. If I were going to attempt that again, right, I would have more clear pass fail criteria around, like, if we don't achieve this milestone by this time, we just shut it down and we move on to the next thing. And I would make sure that it was sort of like idea funding mode fit, right? Like I talked about building a web IDE as a 2-person team, not actually reasonable, not a great idea, right? So it'd be like, is this an idea that's actually tractable by a small team? And maybe it's not 2 people, maybe you have more founders, or maybe you have a friend who's willing to work for equity or something. But like, you need to make sure that the resources that you're going to have immediate access to will be enough to actually see the idea through to a point where it can become self-sustainable. And there was a lot of pressure in that scenario, because it was like, you're just watching your savings dwindle, right? As you're on this journey, and you're like, the clock is ticking, and the clock is ticking with VC. And that's maybe a good segue, a different way. So with VC, you trade those problems for a different set of problems. And the problems with VC, or the problems that you trade it for, are needing a bigger problem with a bigger market opportunity, right? Your idea necessarily has to be what they call venture fundable, right? It has to be something that can return 100 or 1,000 times as much money as they put into it. And then there's the sort of like pressure to deliver, right? Like when you're bootstrapped, you are your own primary critique, right? Outside of whatever the market is telling you, whatever signals you're getting from the market. But with a VC, now you've got market signals, your own signals about whether you're doing a good job or not. And you've also got like the idea of what the VCs have in mind for the company, right? Like what kind of trajectory it should be on, how big of a market. And they're going to be loath to, if you're like, oh, we're going to pivot into underwater basket weaving because we think we can make $100,000 a year doing that. They're going to be like, no, that's not what I funded you for. That's not what this is all about. Not that we've ever tried to pivot into underwater basket weaving, but you just change, you trade one set of issues for a different set of issues. But I think the most important part is just making sure that the fundraising model fits the idea that you have and the outcome that you're looking for.
I love that. That's actually fantastic advice. I guess when you're looking at both these paths that you've gone down, and I think you did a great job of comparing and highlighting pros and cons, I kind of felt like the speed at which the businesses are running might not be too dissimilar, because you said I'm trading one set of problems for the other. But in both cases, there is a speed component in which you need to get to some next stage. Just depends what that next stage is based on if it's bootstrapped or VC. When you look at that speed component, does that, from your experience, obviously having gone down both paths, does one tend to become less stressful? And the reason I'm asking this stress is I'm only assuming, you mentioned bootstrapping, that you're seeing your account dwindle. That's got to be stressful. That is very challenging mentally. That all of a sudden you have a VC, you have accountability. They look for some progress, some milestones. You need to get more funding, because if your idea is of that caliber, you're going to probably need more. There's a speed component to that. Is there any escaping that, or you're just, again, dealing with just a different way of how speed's affecting you?
Yeah. I mean, as second-time founders, we had a sort of idea in mind about how we could maybe escape some of that trap, like the VC trap. So we were very upfront when we raised our Series Seed that, like, yeah, we'll take this money now. We'll do the deal. We know you're excited to do this. We'll do it, but on the stipulation that we're not going to start spending like wild until we see strong signs of product market fit. And that was a way to de-risk the company for us personally, right? For the VC, they see like, well, the idea was either going to work or it wasn't. And so you should spend the money as fast as possible and try to go as fast as possible. And so having that agreement in place at the beginning gave us sort of more breathing room to experiment, to try some things out, to have some failures and not sort of like be really upset or think that it was the end of the world. And then when we did get to that point where we were seeing product market fit, we had to hold up our end of the bargain, and we had to actually start spending and growing the company in order to water that seed and let it blossom into the company that AuthZed is today. So I will say that like that was the way that we sort of negotiated our way out of the day one, Series A is in 12 to 18 months. You need to start showing Series A progress. We were just sort of very upfront with sort of our schedule and our cadence and what we were hoping to accomplish.
I guess, AuthZed, the product itself, obviously we're in a time of AI and everyone is taking advantage of that opportunity, looking at, the product and kind of where AI fits within the scope of your future. Can you talk to us a little bit about, where you see AI as an opportunity?
So we're actually doing business with AI companies right now. I can't name which for contractual reasons, as much as I'd love to. But what we're seeing is that we're seeing a lot of the same problems that apply when you're protecting data from other humans or from malicious actors also happen to just apply when you're protecting data and interactions from AIs, right? So one of these problems that we're solving or that we're helping to solve is like retrieval augmented generation, RAG. So under RAG, you have this vast amount of data that you're making available to the AI, but then you have different individuals who are interacting with the models themselves. And those individuals shouldn't be able to get access to any data via the AI that they wouldn't have had access to otherwise. Right. So what we're helping companies do is we're helping them respect the underlying permissions models around the data at the AI layer. So they have a single interaction point with AuthZed where the AI is saying, can I get access to this document? And then they get back a yes or no. And if they get back a no, they just move on. They don't include that when they're generating their response. So that's one way we're seeing some impact. And another way is helping to guard the actions of agents. So agents are all anybody wants to talk about nowadays. But agents, if you think about them, are kind of just like that really hardworking intern that kind of knows what they're doing, but is willing to just go and push any button and go and do anything. And so we can also build some guardrails around what the agents are allowed to do and federate access or grant access the same way we would to a human trying to push those same buttons and get access to that same information. So we're kind of helping out in those two ways. And we should have some materials around it available on our website soon. But one thing that I'll say is that this isn't like we didn't go and change the product for AI. It just so happens that the same problem that humans have when trying to get access to information also apply to AIs. So from that way, we're not doing anything novel, but just helping people to see the opportunity of using AuthZed with AI.
I like that. That's actually, maybe the best use case is that the product just seamlessly fits within that dynamic. And obviously, I think that's going to be a great opportunity for you guys. And I really do appreciate your time coming on, sharing. I know we kind of covered a lot of startup stuff and some of your work experience going from being an engineer to a founder. If somebody does want to reach out to you to kind of ask you a question, they might be heading down one of these paths and they'd like to kind of get your input. Is there a good way of connecting with you?
Yeah, I'd say probably the best way to directly connect with me would be through our Discord. We run a Discord. The link is on our landing page at authzed.com. If you're not familiar with Discord, it's kind of like a more open Slack that people can just kind of like pop in and pop out of. I'm on the Discord. You can attempt to connect with me via LinkedIn, but following is usually probably better. I have a sort of rule that I don't connect with people on LinkedIn if I haven't spoken to them in person. So don't take it personally if it gets ignored. I'm just trying to keep my network sort of like tight and focused. Other than that, I'm trying out Blue Sky, but I don't know if it's going to stick. So maybe try me there.
Yeah, we'll put a link to your Discord. We'll get that from you guys and put it in there so that somebody can actually leverage that, get in touch with you. But Jake, thanks for being on the show. Thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. It was actually a pleasure.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That's it for this episode. Be back again. Different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, I think the story of when you're an engineer and you go through the process of becoming a founder, we talked a lot with Jake about where those ideas came from, what he had to go through to evaluate them, looking actually at the different ways of funding. He's kind of gone through both, and he has a lot of insights and experience. We talked about the fear of failing as well. So I think a lot of great takeaways. If you are an engineer and you'd like to be a founder one day, I think this is a great episode for you. So share this with other people that might also want to head down that path. Also, like, subscribe, comment. Let me know how the show's going for you. I'd appreciate that. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.